Everyone sees my smile. They always have. If you had met me a few years ago, you would have probably said the same thing everyone else did, that I was lucky, that I had a beautiful life, that there was something soft and warm about me that made people feel at ease. I learned early how to carry that softness like a shield. A gentle voice, a polite laugh, a reassuring nod. These things make people comfortable. They stop them from asking questions. And questions are dangerous. My name is Olivia Hayes. That's the name written on my documents, on the mailbox outside this quiet little house, on the hospital forms I once signed with trembling hands. It's the name people use when they greet me with sympathy now, their voices lowering just slightly, as if grief has a sound and they're trying not to disturb it. But before all of this, before silence filled every corner of my life, I was just Olivia, a woman who believed in ordinary happiness. I still remember the first time I noticed how different my reflection felt from the way people saw me. It was a small moment, so small that anyone else would have forgotten it, but for me, it stayed. It was a winter evening. I had just come home after meeting friends. We had laughed for hours, shared stories, talked about plans about the future. I remember smiling so much that my cheeks hurt. They kept telling me how radiant I looked, how happy I seemed. When I got home, I stood in front of the mirror to take off my makeup. And suddenly, the smile was gone. Not slowly, not gently, it disappeared like it had never been real. My eyes looked tired, not the kind of tired you fix with sleep, but the kind that settles deep inside you, the kind you carry without knowing when it started. I stared at myself for a long time that night. It was the first time I realized something I would come to understand far too well. People only see what you let them see. And mirrors don't lie. But back then, I didn't think much of it. I thought it was just exhaustion, just one of those moments everyone has. I didn't know that one day, that reflection would become the only place where I could no longer pretend. Back then, my life still had color. I met Daniel Hayes on a spring afternoon. It wasn't dramatic. There were no cinematic moments, no music playing in the background. Just a quiet bookstore, the smell of paper and coffee, and a man standing in the wrong aisle looking completely lost. He was holding a book upside down. I remember noticing it before I noticed him. I couldn't help but smile. Not the practiced smile I give people now, but a real one, the kind that comes from somewhere light and easy. "You know that's upside down, right?" I said. He looked at the book, then back at me, slightly embarrassed, but laughing. That explains why I wasn't understanding a single word. That was Daniel, honest, a little awkward, and completely unafraid to laugh at himself. We talked for 20 minutes that day, about books, about nothing, about everything. And when we walked out of the store, the world felt different, lighter. I didn't believe in instant connections before him. I thought those things were exaggerated, something people said to make stories more interesting. But with Daniel, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, comfortable, like something that had always been there waiting. We started meeting often after that. Coffee turned into dinners, dinners turned into long walks, and long walks turned into conversations that stretched late into the night. He used to look at me in a way that made me feel seen. Not just my smile, not just the version of me everyone else knew, but something deeper, something I didn't even fully understand myself. "You don't have to pretend with me," he told me once. I laughed it off at the time. I thought he was being poetic or maybe just kind. I didn't realize he was right. Because even then, even in those early days, there was a part of me that was always performing, always careful, always controlled. But Daniel had a way of making that fade. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe without thinking about how it looked. We got married 2 years later. It was a small wedding, nothing extravagant, just close friends, a few family members, and a simple ceremony in a garden filled with soft white flowers. I remember standing there, looking at him, and feeling something steady and certain. Not overwhelming, not chaotic. Just right. He held my hands and smiled at me, and I thought, this is it. This is what people mean when they talk about home. For a while, everything was exactly what I had hoped it would be. Mornings filled with quiet routines, evenings spent talking about our days, weekends where time seemed to slow down just enough for us to exist without rushing. We built a life together, piece by piece. And I smiled. God, how I smiled. People saw us and said we were perfect. They said we were lucky. They said we had something rare. Maybe we did. Or maybe we just hid our imperfections better than most. Because even in happiness, there are small cracks. Tiny, almost invisible. The kind you ignore because everything else feels too good to question. At first, they didn't matter. A missed call here, a late night there, moments where Daniel seemed distant, like his mind was somewhere else. I told myself it was work, stress, life. We all have our moments, don't we? And I didn't want to be the kind of person who looks for problems where there aren't any. So I smiled. I kept smiling, even when something inside me started to feel off. There was one night I remember clearly. I was standing in front of the mirror again, brushing my hair. Daniel was in the other room, talking on the phone. His voice was low, almost like he didn't want me to hear. I caught my reflection and paused. There it was again. That same look from years ago. That quiet, unexplainable heaviness. I stared at myself, and for a moment I felt something I couldn't name. Not fear, not sadness, something in between. Like a warning. I shook it off. I always did. Because acknowledging it would mean admitting that something wasn't right. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. I turned away from the mirror and walked into the living room, forcing a smile as Daniel ended his call. "Everything okay?" I asked. He smiled back at me, warm, reassuring, familiar. "Yeah," he said, "just work." And I believed him. Or maybe I chose to. Because sometimes the truth isn't hidden from us. Sometimes we just don't want to see it. And that was the beginning. Not of the end, but of the silence that would slowly take everything from me. Even now, when I stand in front of the mirror, I think about that moment. How simple it was. How easy it would have been to ask more questions, to look deeper, to listen to that quiet voice inside me. But I didn't. I smiled instead. And the mirror remembered. Because everyone sees my smile. But only the mirror knows where the story really begins. I wish I could say that everything changed all at once, that there was a single moment when the truth revealed itself clearly and loudly. The kind of moment you see in films where everything suddenly makes sense. But real life does not work that way. Real life is quieter, slower. It shifts in ways so subtle that by the time you realize something is wrong, you are already standing in the middle of it, unsure of how you got there or how to leave. And that is exactly how it happened to me, not with a storm, but with a silence that grew heavier each day, a silence that Daniel carried with him like a shadow I could not reach. At first, it was just small things, things that could easily be explained away if you wanted them to be. And I wanted to believe that nothing had changed, that the life we built was still as steady as it felt in the beginning. But Daniel started coming home later than usual. His messages became shorter, his laughter softer, like something inside him was slowly dimming. And whenever I asked, he would give me the same answer with the same calm expression. "It's just work," and I would nod. Because what else could I do? What proof did I have that something was wrong other than a feeling I could not explain? But feelings have a way of growing. Even when you try to ignore them, they sit quietly in your chest, waiting, watching, collecting moments until they are too heavy to carry unnoticed. And I began to notice more. The way he would check his phone and turn it slightly away from me. The way his eyes sometimes seemed distant even when he was sitting right next to me. The way conversations that once flowed so easily between us started to feel forced, like we were both trying to keep something from breaking. I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself that every marriage has phases, that love does not always look the same every day, that this was normal, and maybe part of me believed that, but another part of me, a quieter, more honest part, knew that something was slipping, something I could not hold onto no matter how tightly I tried. There was one evening that stayed with me longer than the others, not because it was dramatic, but because it felt different in a way I could not ignore. Daniel came home unusually early, and for a moment I felt relieved. I thought maybe things were returning to the way they used to be. Maybe whatever distance had been growing between us was finally fading. I greeted him with a smile, the same smile everyone always saw, and he smiled back. But there was something in his eyes, something unfamiliar, something guarded. We sat down for dinner, and at first everything seemed normal. We talked about small things, about the weather, about a show we had been watching, about nothing that really mattered. And then there was a pause, a quiet moment where neither of us spoke. And in that silence, I felt it again, that weight, that invisible distance stretching between us. "Daniel," I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady, "is everything really okay?" He looked at me for a second longer than usual, like he was deciding how much of the truth he wanted to give me. And then he nodded. "Yeah, Olivia, I told you, it's just work. Things have been a bit stressful lately." I wanted to believe him, I really did, but something inside me refused to settle. Something kept whispering that there was more, that this was not just stress, that this was something deeper, something he was not ready to share. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of fear, not loud or overwhelming, but quiet and persistent. After dinner, he went to take a shower, and I found myself standing alone in the kitchen, staring at nothing, replaying the conversation in my mind, searching for something, anything that would make sense of the feeling I could not shake. And without realizing it, I walked back to the bedroom and stood in front of the mirror again. I don't know why I kept going back to it. Maybe because it was the only place where I felt I could not lie. The only place where the version of me I showed the world did not exist. And when I looked at my reflection, I saw it clearly this time. The uncertainty in my eyes, the quiet fear I had been trying to ignore, the beginning of a question I was not ready to ask. "Am I losing him?" I whispered, the words barely audible even to myself. The mirror did not answer. It never does, but it reflects everything you try to hide. And in that moment, I realized that the doubt inside me was no longer something I could dismiss as imagination. It was real, it was growing, and it was changing the way I saw everything. When Daniel came back into the room, I quickly looked away, forcing that familiar smile onto my face, the one that made everything seem okay, the one that kept people from asking questions. And he didn't notice anything different, or maybe he did and chose not to say anything, just like I had been doing. Days turned into weeks, and the distance between us became harder to ignore. It wasn't just in the late nights or the quiet dinners anymore. It was in the small moments, too. The ones that used to feel effortless, like the way he no longer reached for my hand without thinking, the way his goodnight kisses felt rushed, almost like an obligation rather than a habit born from love. I started to feel alone in a way I had never felt before, not physically, because he was still there, still sharing the same space, the same bed, the same routines. But emotionally, it felt like I was standing on one side of a glass wall, watching him from a distance I could not cross. And still, I said nothing. Because sometimes, silence feels safer than the truth. Sometimes, asking the question means risking an answer you are not ready to hear. So I smiled when he looked at me. I laughed when he tried to keep things light. I played my part perfectly, just like I always had. And to everyone else, nothing had changed. We were still the same couple they admired, still the same story they believed in. But behind that story, behind that carefully maintained image, something was breaking, slowly, quietly, piece by piece. And the only place where that truth existed was in the reflection I could no longer ignore. Because everyone still saw my smile. But every night, when I stood in front of the mirror, I saw something else entirely, something deeper, something heavier. I saw a woman who was beginning to understand that love does not always fade loudly. Sometimes it disappears in silence. And by the time you realize it, you are already standing alone, holding onto something that is no longer there. There are moments in life when you start noticing details you never cared about before, not because they suddenly matter, but because your mind has nowhere else to place the growing unease inside you. And for me, those details began with silence, not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, but the kind that fills a room even when someone is sitting right next to you. The kind that makes you feel like you are speaking into a space that no longer responds the way it used to. Daniel was still there, physically present, still moving through the same routines as before, but something had changed in the way he existed in our shared life, like he had started living slightly outside of it, half in our world and half somewhere I could not reach. And I found myself studying him more than I ever had before, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity, like I was trying to understand a language I once knew fluently but had started forgetting. He would wake up early, earlier than he used to, and sit quietly with his phone in his hand, scrolling through things I could not see. And when I entered the room, he would put it aside a little too quickly, like the act of hiding was becoming natural to him. And I would pretend not to notice because pretending had become easier than confronting the truth I was slowly building in my mind. We still talked, but our conversations had changed shape. They no longer flowed like they used to. Instead, they felt structured, careful, like both of us were avoiding certain doors inside the conversation that neither of us wanted to open. And I began to realize how exhausting it is to maintain normalcy when something inside you knows it is no longer real. One evening, I stood in the kitchen making tea, watching the steam rise slowly from the cup as if it was the only thing in the house still moving without hesitation. And Daniel walked in, paused for a second, then leaned against the counter without saying anything, and I could feel the weight of his presence differently now, not comforting, but distant. "You've been quiet lately," I said carefully, not looking directly at him, because sometimes eye contact makes truth harder to avoid. He gave a small shrug, almost automatic, like the question had already been rehearsed in his mind. "Just tired." Tired? That word had started to mean everything and nothing at the same time. I nodded, because I had learned that pushing too hard only made him withdraw further. But inside me something tightened, something that had been loosening slowly for weeks now, and I could feel it reaching a point where I could no longer pretend it wasn't there. Later that night, I stood in front of the mirror again, and I noticed something different this time, not in my face, but in my expression, like I was starting to recognize myself less and less, like the version of me that smiled so easily in front of others was becoming harder to connect with the one who stood alone in silence. "Why does it feel like I'm losing you?" I whispered, not sure if I was speaking to Daniel or to myself or to the reflection staring back at me. The mirror did not answer, but it never needed to, because it reflects more than appearances. It reflects what you are too afraid to admit out loud. Days passed like that, each one slightly heavier than the last, and I began to notice small inconsistencies in Daniel's behavior that I could not ignore anymore, not because they were dramatic, but because they formed a pattern I could no longer pretend was random. Phone calls that ended when I entered a room, sudden errands late in the evening, explanations that sounded complete but somehow never felt whole. Still, I said nothing, because saying something would mean stepping into uncertainty, and uncertainty is terrifying when you have already built a life that depends on believing everything is fine. One afternoon, I decided to go out alone, just to clear my mind, just to breathe outside the walls that had started to feel too small for the thoughts growing inside me. And as I walked through the streets, I saw couples laughing, holding hands, sharing small moments that looked effortless, and I wondered when our life had stopped looking like that without me realizing it. I passed by a cafe where Daniel and I used to sit together, and I stopped for a moment outside it, staring through the glass, remembering how simple everything used to feel, how easy it was to believe that love was something stable, something that stayed the same if you just kept showing up for it. But nothing stays the same when it starts to drift. That evening, when I returned home, Daniel was already there, sitting on the couch, looking at something on his phone, and when he looked up at me, he smiled briefly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes anymore, and I smiled back, because that is what I always did. "How was your day?" he asked. "Fine," I said like I always did. And that was it. A complete conversation, built on incomplete truths. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay beside him, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, wondering when the sound of someone next to you stopped meaning comfort and started meaning distance, and I realized something I didn't want to accept. I was starting to feel alone, in the presence of the person I loved. So I got up quietly and went to the mirror again, because somehow it had become the only place where I could face what I was afraid to say out loud. I looked at myself for a long time. No makeup, no smile, no performance. Just me. And for the first time, I didn't ask the mirror if I was okay, because I already knew the answer. And somewhere deep inside, I also knew this was only the beginning of something I did not yet understand. Because when silence starts growing between two people, it does not stay silent forever. There is a strange kind of loneliness that does not come from being alone, but from being with someone who no longer feels fully present with you. And I started living inside that feeling without even realizing when it became normal, like a slow shift in temperature that you only notice once you are already cold. And Daniel and I had reached that point without any clear moment of transition. No argument that marked the change. No single event I could point to. Just a gradual fading of something I once thought was permanent. We still shared the same home, the same routines, the same small habits that used to feel comforting, but now even those habits felt like reminders of what was missing between us. And I began to notice how little we actually spoke unless it was necessary, how conversations had become transactional, built around logistics rather than connection, and how silence had started filling spaces where laughter used to live. I tried, in my own quiet way, to bring things back to how they were, not through confrontation, because I was never the kind of person who could force emotions out into the open, but through small gestures, making his favorite meals, asking about his day with genuine care, sitting beside him even when I had nothing to say, hoping that proximity alone might repair what distance had taken away. But hope, I learned, is not always enough to rebuild something that is already shifting away from you. Daniel would respond politely, sometimes warmly, but there was always a layer between us now, something invisible but persistent, like glass we could see through but never fully break, and I found myself studying his reactions more closely, trying to decode meanings in pauses, in glances, in the way he sometimes hesitated before answering simple questions, and that constant analysis began to exhaust me in ways I did not fully understand at first. One evening, I remember sitting across from him at dinner, the table neatly set, the food warm but untouched for a moment as we both sat in a silence that felt heavier than words. And I remember thinking how strange it was that two people who once talked for hours could now sit across from each other without knowing what to say. He eventually broke the silence, asking about my day in a tone that sounded polite but distant, and I answered in the same way I always did. It was fine, because I had learned that anything deeper than that felt unnecessary in a space where real conversations no longer seemed to land. After dinner, he went back to his usual routine, phone in hand, attention divided, and I cleaned up quietly, watching him from time to time without trying to make it obvious, because even observation had become something I had to hide, like I was not allowed to fully acknowledge what I already felt. That night, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. There was something about the stillness of that reflection that made it easier to think clearly, or maybe it just made it harder to lie to myself. And I looked at my face, the same face everyone described as calm, kind, composed, and I wondered how many versions of me existed depending on who was looking. To the world, I was still the same Olivia Hayes, the woman who smiled easily, who spoke gently, who seemed to have everything in place. But in the mirror, I saw something else. Not brokenness exactly, not yet, but something on the edge of it, like a crack forming beneath a surface that still looked intact if you weren't paying attention. "I don't understand what changed," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was speaking to myself or to the reflection. And as always, there was no answer, only silence. But I had started to realize that silence itself can be a form of truth, especially when it stretches long enough to become impossible to ignore. The next few days carried the same rhythm, predictable on the surface, unsettling underneath. And I began to notice that Daniel's absence, even when he was physically present, was becoming more noticeable, like he was slowly withdrawing into a version of himself I could not access anymore. He still smiled sometimes, still asked polite questions, still maintained the structure of our shared life, but something in him felt guarded, like he was carefully choosing what parts of himself to leave in the room and what parts to take away, and I started to feel like I was living beside a person who was slowly becoming unfamiliar. There were moments I almost asked him directly, moments where the question rose to the surface of my thoughts with clarity and urgency, but every time I reached that point, something stopped me, a fear I couldn't fully define, a fear of what the answer might do to the fragile balance we were still maintaining. So instead, I kept watching. I noticed everything. The way he stepped outside more often to take calls, the way he turned his phone screen away instinctively, the way his attention drifted even during conversations that used to hold it completely. And with every observation, my thoughts grew heavier, filling in gaps with possibilities I didn't want to believe. And still, I said nothing. Because sometimes, silence feels safer than truth when you are not ready to lose what you are still trying to hold on to. One afternoon, I received a message from a friend, asking if I wanted to meet for coffee, something simple, something normal, and for a moment I hesitated because I realized how long it had been since I had done anything that didn't revolve around waiting, observing, or thinking about Daniel. I agreed. The cafe was warm, filled with soft background noise, people laughing, cups clinking, life moving in a way that felt slightly distant from where I had been emotionally. And as I sat there listening to my friend talk, I found myself smiling at the right moments, nodding at the right times, performing the version of myself that still functioned in the outside world. But inside, my thoughts kept drifting back. Back to the silence at home. Back to Daniel. Back to the mirror. Because even in a room full of people, I had started feeling like I was living in two places at once, one where I existed normally, and one where I carried questions I was afraid to ask. When I returned home that evening, Daniel was not there yet. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, and I stood in the middle of it for a moment, realizing how quickly absence becomes noticeable when you are already emotionally unsettled. And I felt that familiar tightening in my chest again, the same one that had been growing slowly over time. I went to the bedroom, and then to the mirror. And this time, I didn't just look. I studied myself, as if I was trying to find evidence of something I couldn't yet name. And for the first time, I began to understand something I didn't want to accept. That sometimes, the person who smiles the most is the one who is already learning how to live with loss before it even happens. I started measuring my days in silence. Not in hours or minutes, but in the spaces between conversations, in the pauses that used to feel natural but now felt intentional. As if something unspoken had settled between Daniel and me, and neither of us knew how to name it without making it real. And that uncertainty slowly became the background of everything I did. There was a time when home felt like a place of return, a place where everything outside could be left at the door. But now it felt more like a place of observation, where I was constantly aware of what was said and what was not, what was shared and what was withheld, and I found myself paying attention to details I would have once ignored completely. Daniel's routines had changed in ways that were subtle enough to avoid direct accusation, but consistent enough to disturb me deeply. And I began to realize how much emotional distance can grow without physical separation. How someone can sit next to you and still feel unreachable. And that realization stayed with me more than anything else. He would leave the house at times without much explanation, sometimes mentioning errands, sometimes not mentioning anything at all. And when I asked casually, he would respond with calm certainty that made me feel guilty for even questioning it. And I would nod and let it go because I didn't want to become someone who doubts everything. But doubt doesn't need permission. It grows on its own. One morning, I woke up earlier than usual and found Daniel already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, fully dressed, staring at his phone with an expression I couldn't read. And when I entered the room, he quickly locked the screen and placed the phone beside him, too casually, too rehearsed. and I noticed how quickly that action had become part of his behavior. "Early day?" I asked softly. "Yeah," he replied, not looking up immediately. "A lot going on." There was a time when I would have asked more questions, when I would have naturally followed that sentence with curiosity, with concern, with engagement, but now I just nodded, because I had started to understand that asking sometimes created distance instead of closing it. After he left, I stood in the quiet room for a long time, not doing anything in particular, just existing in the stillness that remained behind him, and I realized how much emotional residue a person leaves behind even when they are no longer present. That day, I cleaned the house more carefully than usual, not because it needed it, but because movement felt easier than thought, and thought had started to feel dangerous in its honesty. And still, even while I was busy, my mind kept circling back to the same point. Something is not right. It wasn't a dramatic realization. It was slow, heavy, certain. I avoided saying it out loud, even in my own thoughts, because numbing it felt like giving it power. But deep down, I already knew I was no longer imagining things. That evening, Daniel came home later than usual. When he walked in, I noticed something different in his face, not exhaustion exactly, but a kind of controlled expression, like he was carefully managing what he allowed to show. And when he saw me, he smiled briefly, just enough to acknowledge me, and I returned the same kind of smile, the one I had learned to use when I didn't want questions either. We sat together for dinner, and again the conversation stayed on the surface, safe topics, simple exchanges, nothing that required emotional depth, and I realized how easily two people can maintain the appearance of connection while slowly losing the substance of it. After dinner, he went to the study room, and I stayed behind in the kitchen longer than necessary, not because I had work left, but because I didn't want to sit in the same room where silence would again take shape between us. Later, I found myself in front of the mirror again. It had become a pattern I didn't fully understand, returning to it like it held answers I wasn't ready to hear from anywhere else, and I looked at myself with a kind of quiet searching, as if my reflection might reveal something I had missed in real life. My face still looked calm, still composed, still familiar to everyone who knew me. But I could see the difference now. Not in appearance, in awareness. There is a difference between not knowing something and pretending not to know it, and I was starting to feel the space between those two things growing smaller. "I feel like I'm waiting for something," I whispered, barely audible. And in that moment, I understood that waiting itself had become part of my life without me choosing it. Waiting for a conversation. Waiting for clarity. Waiting for something to either break or return. But nothing returned. And nothing broke either. It just stayed suspended. Unresolved. Unspoken. The next day passed in the same way, but I began to notice how my mind was no longer willing to accept vague explanations as easily as before, how every small inconsistency now stayed longer in my thoughts, replaying itself in different forms, and I started to feel a shift inside me that I couldn't fully control. Not panic, not anger, something quieter, something heavier, awareness. And awareness, I realized, is not always comforting. Sometimes, it is the beginning of losing the ability to pretend. That night, I lay in bed next to Daniel and listened to his breathing again, the same sound that used to calm me, but now felt distant, like it belonged to someone I was no longer fully connected to. And I stared at the ceiling for a long time, wondering when exactly things had started changing, and more importantly, why I hadn't stopped them when I still could. Eventually, I got up quietly and went to the mirror, not because I expected answers, but because I needed something real in a life that was starting to feel uncertain in every direction. And when I looked at myself that night, I didn't see confusion anymore. I saw something closer to acceptance forming slowly. Because deep down, I was beginning to understand something I wasn't ready to say out loud yet. That sometimes, the hardest part of love is not losing someone. It is realizing they might have already started leaving, long before you noticed. There comes a point where silence stops feeling like confusion and starts feeling like information, like it is no longer something you are trying to interpret, but something you are being forced to understand. And I reached that point without a clear moment marking the transition, just a slow accumulation of days where everything looked normal on the surface, but felt increasingly unfamiliar underneath. Daniel and I continued living in the same house, continuing the same routines, continuing the same small patterns that made our life appear intact from the outside. But I had begun to notice how carefully that normal was being maintained, like both of us were participating in something we no longer fully believed in, but were still unwilling to break. I stopped asking direct questions, not because I didn't have them, but because I had started to understand that answers were no longer coming in the form of words. Instead, I began to observe more quietly, paying attention to the rhythm of his absence even when he was present, the way he emotionally stepped out of rooms without physically leaving them, the way conversations ended just slightly too early, as if neither of us wanted to extend them into something more vulnerable. And strangely, Daniel also stopped asking me things. Not out of disinterest, but out of a kind of mutual emotional caution that neither of us had acknowledged out loud, and that absence of curiosity between us felt more significant than any argument would have. One evening, I remember sitting on the couch while he was in the kitchen, and I realized how long it had been since we had shared a moment that didn't feel scheduled or functional, how long it had been since we had laughed without effort, and that realization didn't arrive dramatically. It simply settled in quietly, like dust gathering on something once cherished but now unattended. I tried to remember when it had started. When exactly had we stopped being fully present with each other? But memory doesn't give clear answers when change happens slowly. It only shows fragments. I remembered the beginning. I remembered the warmth. I remembered the ease. But the middle was becoming harder to define. That night, Daniel came home later than usual again. When he walked in, I noticed the same controlled expression, the same careful neutrality in his face. And when he greeted me, it was gentle but distant, like he was trying not to disrupt something fragile that already existed between us. "How was your day?" I asked automatically. "Busy," he replied just as automatically. And that was it. The conversation ended there, without needing to end. We sat together for dinner, and I noticed how little we filled the silence now, how comfortable we had become with not trying to bridge it anymore. And I wondered if this was what emotional distance looks like when it becomes permanent enough to stop being questioned. After dinner, he went to the study again. I stayed in the kitchen longer than necessary. Not because I had anything left to do, but because I had started avoiding shared spaces where silence felt louder than presence. And then, as I stood there, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else so far. I had started organizing my life around his emotional availability. Without meaning to. Without choosing to. Just adjusting slowly, quietly, until I no longer noticed I was doing it. Later that night, I went to the mirror again. And this time, something felt different. Not in my reflection, but in my reaction to it. I didn't search for answers anymore. I didn't try to decode my expression, or interpret my eyes, or find meaning in the fatigue I had started to recognize as normal. I just looked, and I understood. That was the first time I felt the shift inside me, not towards panic, not towards denial, but towards clarity that I wasn't emotionally prepared for. Because clarity doesn't always arrive like truth. Sometimes it arrives like recognition of something you have already been living inside, without admitting it. "I think I already know," I said softly to myself. And I did. I just hadn't allowed myself to fully accept it yet. The next morning, I noticed something small but unsettling. Daniel had left earlier than usual, but what stayed with me was not his departure. It was the absence of anything left behind emotionally, like even the traces of his presence were becoming lighter, more temporary. And I found myself standing in the doorway longer than I needed to, just staring at the space he had occupied moments ago. That feeling followed me through the day. At work, I smiled when needed, responded when expected, performed every interaction with the same external ease I had always maintained. But internally, I was no longer fully inside those moments. I was split between two states, one that functioned, and one that observed. And the observer was becoming stronger. In the evening, I received a message from Daniel saying he would be late. No explanation, no detail, just a sentence that had become increasingly familiar. I stared at it for a long time before replying with the only response that felt safe. Okay. And that was it. No questions, no follow-up, just acceptance of distance that was no longer surprising. That night, I didn't wait up for him the way I used to. Instead, I sat alone in the living room, watching nothing in particular, letting time pass without trying to shape it. And I realized how quiet my life had become, not because there was no sound, but because I had stopped expecting sound to mean connection. When Daniel finally returned, I was already in the bedroom. I heard him move through the house, the familiar sounds of a routine I was no longer part of in the same way. And when he entered the room later, I pretended to be half asleep, because that felt easier than engaging in a version of conversation that would say nothing new. He lay beside me without speaking, and for a long time, neither of us moved. Just two people occupying the same space, separated by something neither of us had named yet. And in that stillness, I realized something that settled deep inside me. Sometimes relationships don't end loudly. They don't break. They don't collapse. They just slowly stop meeting each other in the same place. And the hardest part is not noticing the change. It is realizing you have already learned how to live inside it. There is a kind of sadness that doesn't arrive like a moment. It builds like weather, slowly changing the atmosphere of your life until you realize you haven't felt anything light in a long time. And I think that's what happened to me without me fully noticing when it began, because by the time I understood it, I was already living inside it. Days had started blending into each other in a way that made them hard to separate, not because nothing was happening, but because everything was happening in the same emotional tone, quiet, controlled, distant, and Daniel had become a presence I could predict but no longer feel close to, like a familiar outline that no longer carried warmth. We still spoke when necessary, we still shared meals, we still acknowledged each other's existence with politeness that looked like normal life from the outside. But inside me, something had changed, something subtle but irreversible, like a door that had quietly closed without a sound and could no longer be reopened the same way. I began noticing how often I adjusted myself around him without thinking, how I would lower my voice when he seemed distracted, how I would avoid certain questions depending on his mood, how I had started calculating emotional risk in simple conversations, and I realized I was no longer just living with him. I was also managing him emotionally, carefully, cautiously, like walking on a surface I didn't fully trust anymore. And the most painful part was that he was not cruel. He was not loud. He was not obvious. He was just distant in a way that could not be easily questioned without sounding irrational. One evening, I remember clearly, I was sitting near the window, watching the street outside, people moving with their own lives, laughter from somewhere far, the sound of normality continuing without interruption, and I felt like I was watching life from behind glass, present but not fully inside it. Daniel came in later that night. I heard his keys, his footsteps, the familiar rhythm of his arrival, but I didn't move immediately because I had started to delay reactions, as if delaying emotion made it easier to manage. When he entered the room, he looked tired in a way that had become routine, and when he saw me, he gave a small nod instead of a greeting, and I responded the same way, because that had become our language now, minimal, efficient, emotionally reduced. "How was your day?" I asked anyway. "Same," he said. Same. That word started to mean everything and nothing at the same time. After that, there was no more conversation. Just presence. And absence within presence. Later that night, I stood in front of the mirror again, and I noticed something I hadn't before, not in my face, but in my stillness, like I had started becoming quieter even inside myself, like even my thoughts were learning not to make too much noise. I looked at myself for a long time, and I realized I was no longer searching for explanations in my reflection. I was searching for confirmation. Confirmation of something I already knew, but was still unwilling to fully accept. I don't feel like I'm part of his world anymore, I said softly. The mirror reflected everything without responding, as always, but this time I didn't need it to. Because silence had already started answering me in other ways. The next few days carried a strange consistency. Daniel left early, returned late, maintained polite distance, and I maintained my own version of stability, because stability had become something I performed rather than something I felt. And I started noticing something else too. I was no longer surprised by anything. Not by his distance. Not by his silence. Not by the emotional space growing between us. I was only observing it now, like a slow realization that had already crossed the point of shock. One afternoon, I found myself standing in our bedroom holding a shirt of his, just staring at it without any clear thought, and I remember thinking how strange it is that objects still carry closeness when people don't. Fabric remembers. Rooms remember. But people change. That evening, Daniel and I crossed paths in the hallway. He paused for a second, as if deciding whether to say something, and then he simply stepped aside to let me pass, and I did the same, and in that small movement, I felt something final without it being spoken. We were no longer moving toward each other. We were just moving around each other. And that difference was becoming harder to ignore. Later that night, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea that had gone cold without me drinking it, and I realized I was not even thinking about asking questions anymore. Not because I had answers, but because I had started to understand that some answers don't come from asking. They come from watching long enough to see patterns you can't unsee. When I went to the mirror that night, I didn't speak. I just looked. And for the first time, I didn't see confusion. I saw recognition. A quiet understanding forming in the way I held myself. And I understood something I had been avoiding for a long time. That love does not always end with loss. Sometimes it ends with gradual disappearance, while both people are still standing beside each other. And the most painful part is not when it breaks. It is when you realize it has already changed shape without ever telling you. There is a strange exhaustion that comes from living inside something you no longer fully believe in, but still continue to maintain. And I started feeling that exhaustion not in dramatic ways, but in small moments that added up quietly, like waking up already tired, like smiling a little slower, like thinking a little longer before speaking, as if even basic life required more effort than it used to. By now, Daniel and I had become experts in distance. Not the kind that separates cities or rooms, but the kind that exists between two people who still share space, but no longer share emotional direction. And I could feel it in everything, even in the way we moved around each other in the house, careful, minimal, almost respectful in a way that felt unfamiliar for a marriage that once held warmth so naturally. We had stopped arguing long ago, and I realized something unsettling about that. Arguments, at least, mean engagement. Silence means something else. One evening, I stood in the kitchen longer than usual, not doing anything in particular, just watching water boil as if it had answers I needed. And Daniel walked in, paused briefly, and leaned against the counter without saying much. And for a moment we were just there again, two people occupying the same space with nothing bridging the emotional gap between them. "You're quiet," he said finally. I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because of how late the observation had come. "I guess I am," I replied. There was a pause. Not uncomfortable. Not comfortable either. Just empty. He nodded slightly, like that explanation was enough. And maybe for him it was, because people often only ask questions they are prepared to leave unanswered. After a moment, he left the kitchen again, and I stayed behind, realizing how quickly interactions had reduced themselves to fragments. That night, I stood in front of the mirror again, and I noticed something I hadn't fully acknowledged before. I wasn't looking for Daniel anymore in my thoughts. I was looking for myself, and I wasn't fully sure where I had gone. My reflection looked familiar, but not fully inhabited, like I was present in appearance but slightly removed in feeling, and I wondered when exactly I had started living like this, half inside my life and half observing it from a distance. "I don't feel like myself anymore," I whispered. And the mirror didn't respond, but it didn't need to, because I could already see it. The next few days passed in the same pattern, but something inside me began to shift, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that felt like clarity slowly replacing confusion. I started noticing things differently. Not just Daniel's behavior, but my own reactions to it. How quickly I adapted. How easily I accepted emotional absence as routine. How quietly I had stopped expecting things to improve. And that realization was not painful at first. It was simply clear. Clarity can feel like relief before it becomes something heavier. One afternoon, I went out alone again. I walked without direction, not because I was lost, but because movement felt easier than stillness, and stillness had started to feel like a place where too many thoughts gathered at once. I passed familiar streets, familiar faces, familiar sounds of life continuing normally, and I realized how separate I felt from all of it, like I was participating in the shape of life, but not its emotional experience. At one point, I stopped near a shop window and saw my reflection again, faint against the glass, layered over the world behind it, and I noticed how easily a person can exist in two versions at once, the one that is seen and the one that is felt internally. And I wondered which one was more real. When I returned home, Daniel was already there, sitting on the couch, looking at his phone. He looked up briefly when I entered. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I replied. And that was it. That was our entire conversation in that moment. Two words exchanged like routine. No emotion attached. No depth required. And yet, strangely, nothing felt surprising anymore. That night, I didn't immediately go to the mirror. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, just thinking, not about what was happening, but about how long it had been happening without me fully admitting it to myself. Because denial doesn't always feel like denial. Sometimes it feels like patience. Sometimes it feels like hope. Sometimes it feels like normal life. But eventually, it stops feeling like anything except avoidance. When I finally stood in front of the mirror later that night, I didn't ask questions. I didn't search for meaning. I just looked. And for the first time, I noticed something different. Not in my face, but in my acceptance of what I was seeing. The sadness wasn't new anymore. The confusion wasn't new anymore. Even the distance wasn't new anymore. It had all become familiar. And familiarity has a way of disguising pain as routine. "I think I've been adjusting to losing him without realizing it," I said quietly. And in that moment, I understood something that settled deeper than anything before it. Sometimes relationships don't collapse. They don't end. They don't explode. They just slowly teach you how to live without being emotionally inside them. And by the time you realize it, you've already learned how to survive it. There is a point in emotional distance where you stop expecting sudden change, not because you have given up entirely, but because your mind has started adapting to a new normal without asking for permission. And I think I crossed that point somewhere between silence and acceptance, though I cannot name the exact moment it happened. Life with Daniel continued in its quiet, controlled rhythm, the kind of rhythm that looks stable from the outside, but feels increasingly unfamiliar on the inside. And I had begun to notice how even our smallest interactions carried a kind of emotional caution, as if both of us were aware that too much honesty might break the fragile balance we were still maintaining. We spoke when necessary. We coordinated when required. We shared space without conflict. But connection, real connection, had become something I could only remember rather than feel. And strangely, neither of us tried to fix it anymore. That realization didn't arrive with shock. It arrived with clarity. One evening, I found myself sitting alone in the living room long after Daniel had gone to the study room, and I remember thinking how strange it was that loneliness can exist so completely in a shared home, how presence does not guarantee closeness, and how silence can grow so comfortable that you forget it used to feel like something was missing. I stared at the television without really watching it, letting time pass in the background, and I noticed how my mind had started filling gaps automatically, not with hope anymore, but with explanations that no longer surprised me. Daniel is busy. Daniel is distant. Daniel is somewhere else emotionally. Not as questions, but as statements I no longer argued with. Later that night, I stood in front of the mirror again, and I noticed something subtle but important. I no longer looked for signs of what was happening. I already knew. Now I was only observing how I was changing in response to it. My expression looked calmer than before, but it wasn't peace. It was adaptation. A quiet kind of emotional adjustment that happens when you stop resisting reality and start living inside it instead. I think I stopped expecting him to come back emotionally, I whispered. And I realized I wasn't sad when I said it. I was simply aware. The next few days passed with the same consistency, but I began to notice something different in myself, not in my thoughts exactly, but in my energy, like I was slowly withdrawing from the emotional urgency I used to carry. I stopped analyzing every small behavior. I stopped replaying conversations repeatedly in my mind. I stopped waiting for explanations that never came. And in that space of stopping, something unexpected happened. I started noticing myself again. Not Daniel. Not the distance. Not the silence. But me. What I felt. What I needed. What I had stopped asking for. One afternoon, I went through old photos on my phone, not intentionally searching for anything emotional, just scrolling without purpose, and I came across pictures from a time that felt almost unfamiliar now. Smiling versions of me. Laughing versions of me. Versions of me that existed before emotional distance became part of my daily life. And I realized something uncomfortable. I could still recognize that version of myself, but I could no longer feel her. That night, Daniel came home later than usual again. I didn't ask where he had been. Not because I didn't care, but because I had started to understand that asking had stopped changing anything. He greeted me briefly, and I responded in the same way, and then we both moved into our separate spaces of the house like it had become the most natural thing in the world. No tension. No conflict. Just separation inside closeness. Later, I stood in front of the mirror again. But this time, I noticed something I hadn't before. My reflection wasn't confused anymore. It wasn't searching. It wasn't questioning. It was observing. And there is a difference between those two states that I can't fully explain, except to say that one still hopes for answers, and the other has already started accepting what it sees. I think I understand what's happening now, I said softly. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to deny it afterward. Because understanding doesn't always bring comfort. Sometimes it brings clarity that is too honest to ignore. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual and sat by the window for a long time, watching the world outside continue in its normal rhythm. People going to work, children going to school, life moving forward without hesitation. And I realized how easily life continues even when something inside you feels like it has shifted permanently. Daniel passed by briefly before leaving. He didn't say much, just a nod, and I returned it. And that small exchange carried the weight of everything we were no longer saying out loud. After he left, I stayed by the window for a while longer, not thinking about the past, not imagining the future, just existing in the present with a clearer awareness than I had felt in a long time. And I understood something quietly settling inside me. That sometimes the end of emotional connection does not announce itself. It simply becomes visible enough that you can no longer pretend it isn't there. And once you see it clearly, you can never unsee it again. There is a strange kind of acceptance that doesn't feel like peace. It feels more like understanding something you wish you had understood earlier. And I think I entered that space without choosing it fully, just by living long enough inside the same emotional pattern until it stopped surprising me. Life with Daniel had become something structured, predictable, and emotionally distant in a way that no longer created confusion, only awareness. And I had started to recognize the difference between not knowing what is happening and simply no longer pretending that it isn't happening. We still functioned as a married couple in the eyes of the world. We still shared meals, shared space, shared routines. But emotionally, we were no longer moving in the same direction. And that truth had started to feel less like a shock and more like a fact I carried quietly inside me. One evening, I remember sitting in the kitchen after dinner while Daniel was in another room, and I noticed how natural it had become for us to separate ourselves within the same home, like emotional distance had turned into a habit neither of us questioned anymore. There was no argument, no confrontation, no moment of clarity spoken out loud. Just a gradual shift that had already completed itself without announcement. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down, not because I was thirsty, but because I didn't feel like moving immediately, and I realized how often I now paused in spaces without purpose, just existing in them while my thoughts continued working in the background. Later that night, Daniel and I crossed paths briefly in the hallway. He slowed slightly when he saw me. So did I. And for a moment, we just stood there in the same space, not speaking, not asking, not explaining. Then he said softly, "I'll be out early tomorrow." And I nodded. "That's fine." And that was the entire conversation. No follow-up, no curiosity, no emotional weight attached to the words anymore. Just information exchanged between two people who once shared everything and now shared only logistics. After he went to the bedroom, I stayed in the hallway for a moment longer, not because anything was happening, but because I could feel how easily distance becomes normal when it lasts long enough. And that realization didn't hurt the way it used to. It just settled. That night, I stood in front of the mirror again, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to search for hidden meanings in my reflection. I already knew what I was looking at. A woman who had adapted. A woman who had stopped resisting what was already unfolding. A woman who had learned how to live inside emotional absence without collapsing under it. "I don't think we're the same people we were anymore," I said quietly. And there was no denial inside me when I said it. Only recognition. The next morning, Daniel left earlier than usual. I saw him briefly before he stepped out. He paused like he might say something more, but he didn't. And I didn't either. Just a small nod between us, like two people acknowledging a shared past that no longer had a present. After he left, the house felt different, not emptier, because emptiness implies something missing suddenly, but quieter in a way that felt consistent now. And I realized I was no longer measuring his absence emotionally the way I used to. I was just nodding it. As fact. Not feeling. And that was new. I went through my day with a kind of calm that didn't come from happiness, but from emotional exhaustion turning into acceptance, and I noticed how even my reactions to things had started changing. Less questioning, less replaying, less internal resistance, more observation, more understanding, more silence. In the evening, I received a message from Daniel again, saying he would be late. I read it. I didn't overthink it. I didn't search for hidden meaning. I simply replied, "Okay," and put my phone down. And that small act felt different than before. Not because the situation had changed, but because I had. That night, I didn't wait for him emotionally the way I used to, sitting in anticipation, building invisible scenarios in my mind, trying to interpret timing and tone. Instead, I moved through my own space. I made tea. I cleaned a little. I sat down and let the evening pass without attaching myself to what I could not control. And somewhere in that quiet, I realized something I had been avoiding understanding fully. That I was no longer living inside uncertainty. I was living inside clarity. I had finally stopped resisting. When Daniel finally returned late that night, I heard him, but I didn't react immediately. Not out of distance, but out of something closer to calm. When I eventually saw him, there was the usual brief exchange, the same minimal acknowledgement, and then we both moved past each other into our separate routines again. No tension, no conflict, just continuation. And later, when I stood in front of the mirror again, I didn't search for answers. I didn't ask questions. I simply looked at myself and recognized what had changed. Not my situation, not my surroundings, but my relationship to it all. Because I was no longer standing inside confusion. I was standing inside understanding. And understanding, I realized, is not always comforting. Sometimes it is just the moment you stop waiting for something to become different and accept that it already has. There is a stage in emotional distance where even pain starts losing its sharpness, not because it disappears, but because you become used to its presence, like a background noise you no longer react to. And I think I had reached that stage without fully noticing when the transition happened. Life with Daniel had settled into something I can only describe as structured separation, not in a dramatic sense, not in a hostile sense, but in a quiet, almost respectful distance where two people continue sharing a life without actively participating in each other's inner worlds anymore. We functioned. We coordinated. We maintained appearances. But emotionally, we were no longer reaching toward each other at all. And what once felt like confusion had now become something closer to clarity that I didn't resist anymore. One evening, I remember standing in the kitchen longer than usual, not doing anything important, just letting my mind wander without trying to control where it went. And I realized how often I now lived in pauses, in between moments, in the silence between actions, as if my life had slowly shifted from experience to observation. Daniel came home later that night, as he often did now, and I heard him enter without urgency, without announcement, and when he passed by the kitchen, he briefly looked at me, nodded slightly, and continued on his way. No conversation followed. Not because there was conflict, but because conversation itself had become unnecessary between us, unless it served a purpose. After he went to the bedroom, I stayed behind for a while, not because I needed anything, but because I had started delaying transitions between spaces, as if slowing down movement made me feel more in control of something that was otherwise slipping into routine. And that was when I realized something quietly unsettling. I was no longer trying to understand Daniel. I was trying to understand how I had adapted to him. That night, I stood in front of the mirror again, and I noticed something I hadn't fully acknowledged before. My reflection looked steady. Not happy. Not sad. Just steady. And that steadiness felt unfamiliar, in a way I couldn't immediately explain. It wasn't emotional stability. It was emotional acceptance. "I think I've stopped waiting for things to go back," I said softly. And for the first time, I didn't feel any resistance in saying it. The next few days passed in a calm that no longer felt temporary. It felt established. Daniel continued his routine of leaving early and returning late. I continued mine of adjusting quietly, observing silently, and existing without emotional urgency. And somewhere in that repetition, something inside me began to shift again, but this time not toward confusion or fear, but toward a deeper awareness of myself. I started noticing things I had ignored for a long time. How much of my emotional energy had been spent interpreting someone else's distance. How often I had shaped my thoughts around his silence. How much of my inner world had become reactive instead of self-directed. And that realization didn't come with sadness. It came with clarity that felt almost uncomfortable in its honesty. One afternoon, I found myself sitting alone with an old journal I hadn't opened in a long time, and as I turned its pages, I saw a version of myself that still questioned, still hoped, still analyzed every emotional detail as if answers could be extracted from repetition. And I realized I was no longer that person. Not because I had become stronger, but because I had stopped expecting emotional repair from something that was no longer actively being repaired. That evening, Daniel and I shared dinner again. The conversation, if it could be called that, stayed minimal. A few words exchanged, a few acknowledgments, and then silence again. But this time, silence didn't feel like tension. It felt like structure, like something we had unconsciously agreed to live inside. After dinner, I went to the bedroom earlier than usual. Daniel stayed behind. And for the first time, I didn't wait emotionally for his presence to define the rest of my evening. Instead, I sat by myself and let time pass without anchoring it to his actions. And in that space, something shifted in a quiet but undeniable way. I started realizing that emotional absence, when it lasts long enough, stops feeling like something happening to you and starts becoming something you learn to live around. Not inside, not against, but around. And that distinction changed everything I thought I understood about loss. Later, I stood in front of the mirror again. And I didn't search for anything this time. No questions. No interpretations. No hidden meanings. Just presence. And in that presence, I recognized something I hadn't been willing to see earlier. That I was no longer waiting for Daniel to return emotionally. And I was no longer breaking because he hadn't. I was simply learning how to exist in a life where emotional connection had already shifted into something quieter, something distant, something irreversible in its current form. I think I've finally accepted it, I whispered. And this time, acceptance didn't feel like surrender. It felt like the beginning of seeing things clearly without needing them to change first. Because sometimes, the hardest truth is not that someone has drifted away. It is realizing that you have already learned how to live without reaching for them anymore. There are moments when life doesn't give you closure in a dramatic way. It simply continues. And in that continuation, you begin to understand things you once kept postponing in your mind. And I think that is what happened to me in the final stretch of what I now recognize as a long emotional turning point rather than a single event. By then, Daniel and I were no longer struggling with distance. We had already adapted to it. It had become part of our structure, part of our silence, part of the way we moved through the same space without expecting emotional convergence anymore. And strangely, that realization did not arrive with pain the way I once feared it would. It arrived with clarity that felt almost too calm to question. One morning, I woke up earlier than usual and sat by the window for a long time, watching the world outside move with a kind of continuity that felt distant from my internal experience. And I noticed how life never pauses to reflect on emotional transitions happening within individuals. Everything continues. People continue. Time continues. And we are the only ones who feel the pause inside ourselves. Daniel passed through the hallway briefly before leaving, and I saw him only for a moment, dressed for the day, composed as always, carrying the same emotional distance he had carried for a while now. He paused slightly, not because something needed to be said, but because that had become our habit, brief acknowledgments of presence without emotional extension. And then he left, and I didn't follow him emotionally the way I used to. I stayed where I was, not waiting, not hopping, just present in my own space. And that felt different. Later in the day, I moved through my routine quietly, and I realized I was no longer analyzing his absence or presence with urgency. It had become information, rather than emotional disruption. And that shift inside me was subtle but irreversible. That evening, Daniel returned late again. We exchanged the same minimal greetings. We shared the same quiet dinner. We occupied the same house. But something had changed in how I experienced it. I was no longer inside the emotional uncertainty. I was observing it from a distance that felt strangely stable. And that stability made me realize something important. Not everything unresolved stays painful forever. Some things simply become understood. After dinner, I did not wait for emotional connection to reappear in the room. Instead, I went through my own quiet routine, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was no longer organizing my internal state around someone else's emotional availability. And that realization felt like breathing differently after a long period of holding tension. Later, I stood in front of the mirror again, and I looked at myself without searching for signs or meanings. No questions formed in my mind. No emotional negotiation took place internally. I simply saw myself as I was in that moment. A woman who had lived through emotional distance long enough to understand it without collapsing under it. A woman who had stopped expecting reversal and started recognizing reality as it stood. And in that stillness, I finally understood something I had been circling for a long time. Everyone had once seen my smile. Everyone had once assumed I was fine. But only the mirror had ever seen the full truth beneath it. And now, even that truth had changed shape. Because I was no longer pretending. And I was no longer breaking in silence. I was simply aware. I understand now, I said softly, not to anyone, not to the past, not to the reflection, but to the reality I had finally stopped resisting. And that was the end of something I had been living inside, without numbing it. Not the end of love. Not the end of memory. But the end of illusion. Because sometimes, life doesn't end a story loudly. It just quietly teaches you how to live beyond it. And I finally understood what my reflection had known all along. That the person smiling in front of the world is not always the one living inside it. And only the mirror ever knew the difference.